Coming to thought liberation, and I would like to start by making a distinction here between liberation thought and thought liberation. So there are scholars who are writing on liberation thought, and in particular looking at our leaders, nationalist leaders, those that brought about independence, taking their thoughts, their philosophies, their perspectives and ideas as liberation thoughts, as liberation perspectives, and sometimes this borders on religion. And there's, in particular, in the book, in the lecture, I talk about the one on Kwame Nkrumah. That liberation is a call, so it's very different. I argue that it's a call for the discovery of self as an able and a capable being that can produce progressive thought, that can produce progressive actions, and achieve the intended developmental goal. So it's important that, in a sense, thought liberation has to be about progressive thoughts, has to be about progressive perspectives, because we want to advance human condition. It's about improving, in simplistic terms, the lives of the people. It's not just about some kind of a philosophy or some idea that maybe a particular leader stands for. And most importantly, it has to do with practical actions that need to be undertaken to bring about change. So when I talk about that liberation, I have in mind a process and an outcome of a deliberate program of action. So it has to be practical. We need to unlearn, and I say a lot more about this in the written lecture, that we need to unlearn what we've been taught or fed because it's incorrect. We need to relearn, so learn anew, and also we need to unthink and rethink the dominant thought patterns in particular. And I'm going to say a bit more about what I mean about dominant thought patterns that we need to rethink. And we've acquired this over the period of 500 years. So it's something that we need to work very hard to unlearn and to also rethink. On the critical consciousness, and here I use Paul Freire, and I'll be saying something about that as a guideline for thinking about critical consciousness. Increasing critical consciousness involves the sensitization of citizenry so that the citizens can be self-aware of their rights that nature and the various constitutional dispensations confer on them as free-born citizens. We may end up in chains, but we are born free. And we need to be self-aware of those rights also and responsibilities that the nature confer on us. Critical consciousness also involves extricating ourselves from false values, from inertia, from apathy, from gullibility, and indifference to abuse from foreign and domestic powers. We use, I argue, inappropriate frameworks, compasses, guidelines to live our lives. And this we need to change because they are false. And I say more about this in the lecture, that in a sense this was inculcated by colonialists through various means, and that we need to change that. So to be critical conscious means that you have to extricate yourself, and I think only yourself, only ourselves can do that to ourselves. It also involves inculcating citizenry that is not only responsible and accountable, but also demands responsibility and accountability from their leaders. So we do need to be asking more of our leaders on what they do or what they promised they're going to do, and often they renege or become something else that I explain according to Franz Fanon in the written lecture. This Brazilian education philosophy is very useful when you think about critical consciousness. Paulo Freire, in his classic text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, published in 1970, first published in 1970, says that we need to learn to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions And we need to be able to take action against the oppressive elements of the reality that we observe. Franz Fanon puts this better, by the way, that he argues that our antennae need to be always alert so that we can pick up the signals. So in an instance where you may be confronted with a challenging situation, you must be aware and be able to address it. So we do need to be able to perceive these social, economic, and political contradictions. And most importantly, I must say here that it is important how you package and deliver knowledge. Knowledge existed before the arrival of colonists, as I argue in the lecture. So we need to be able to package it and deliver it in such a way that it can increase critical consciousness, and also it should be forward-looking, because it's about development and advancement of the human condition. From a historical perspective, we know that the colonial and racist narratives are just that. The colonial and racist narratives, and they are not true. So contrary to those narratives, Africa has been blessed with a number of thought leaders, both during the pre-colonial and the post-colonial times, but also during the colonial and even in our neo-colonial times. We do have these thought leaders who have come up with ideas, perspectives that could bring about change. In the lecture, I talk about, for instance, Friedrich Hegel, that should be familiar to all of us, in his treatise, The Philosophy of History, where he basically dismisses Africa, whether Africa had any history, had any life, or existed. So this kind of, in a sense, racist ignorance and arrogance needs to be challenged, and there are many who've been writing on this. I, for instance, discuss an interesting small book that Monificate Asante released about a year ago on Herodotus in Egypt. Herodotus talking about what he learned in Egypt, then that he applied in Greece. So in many instances, what we think of as Greek philosophy actually originates here in the African continent. And check out that Diop and many others who confirm, argue, and provide evidence for this, that Africa is indeed the beginning of humanity, the cradle of humankind. And in the lecture, I talk a bit about Walata and Timbuktu, because these two, far before the arrival of colonists in Africa, already had very advanced knowledge generation institutions. And in Timbuktu, many people will be familiar with this. There are scripts currently that had to be preserved, and which indicate actually that already we had very advanced production of knowledge far before the arrival of colonialists. I mentioned here some of the pre-colonial thinkers who actually developed ideas that guided the governance of ancient kingdoms, but also empires that were able to come up with ways, philosophies, and approaches to govern community life. For instance, there is this issue, a debatable issue that I debate with my students about slave trade. That literature, the Eurocentric literature argues that actually Arabs and Europeans found slave trade or slave life, for the better formulation, here in the African continent, which is actually untrue. And I argue, when I respond to those views, that it seems to me that it's impossible for a European to understand a community life that they just arrived in to reach the conclusion that the way people are relating is a form of slavery. And of course, we've got these other great thinkers in the post-colonial Africa, and I mentioned them there, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. But the point I make about them is that these leaders have propounded various perspectives that are conceptually and practical touchstones for Africa's renewal and transformation. So in a sense, there have always been ideas, perspectives, and philosophies in the African continent that could take the continent forward. And I'm going to say why we think this is not happening. I also make a point and go into a bit of detail about African intellectuals and indicate in the written lecture some of the readings that we could possibly look at to better understand the roles, the various roles and responsibilities that African intellectuals have played. And of course, they've come up with very significant theories over time that can actually help extricate Africa from the clutches of the global imperial designs. These global imperial designs, I'm not sure if my colleagues from the Achimafaji Institute are here, and Department of Politics, so I see some of them here. The scholars of decolonial thought actually argue that the challenge that we're facing is that although colonialism ended, but the forms of structures, knowledge, culture, language, and so forth, which still exist, are used by the Euro-American dominant paradigms to alienate them and to think of them as primitive and or inferior. So in a sense, there is continuity of coloniality, which we need to challenge. So we need to challenge systems and structures that reproduce coloniality. And I say something here about Twain Falola, who in one of his books recently, well, about 10 years ago, 2004, makes a point when he discusses this role of African intellectuals, how, for instance, they've had to challenge these various perspectives that are not accurate about the African continent, for instance, that the African continent had no knowledge, had no history, and so forth. One of the key issues we need to address, if you think about Africa's development, has to be colonial knowledge generation, knowledge production, and knowledge distribution. We know that colonialism pursued an education policy that distorted African history. It de-emphasized its creativity. It suppressed its critical thinking and diminished the consciousness of Africans. And that we do need to challenge. And to do that, it means we have to change the content of the knowledge or the knowledge production. And this colonial education also elevated European history. I think many people identify with this, the history that we studied. And it sidelined, for lack of a better word, culture, language of Africans and our history. The colonial and racist system, I argue, waged a psychological warfare against us Africans, from which we need to liberate ourselves. So we do need to extricate ourselves from the psychological or psychosocial damage that we may have gone through. It's been a long day. Again, I use Franz Fanon, who I think is a very useful thinker when you think about how colonialists have suppressed our history, distorted it, disfigured it. And that this colonial education also was to ensure that it produces citizens that end up lacking the knowledge of who they are, and citizens that are, or their leaders who are satisfied with the crumbs from the tables of former and new colonial masters. And here in South Africa, actually, is even more interesting if you think about Bantu education. So, and people have written about this. Isaac Bangata Tabata wrote, and I referred to him in the written lecture, about what the Bantu education was intended to achieve. And Twain Falola has written about this in the context of Africa as a whole, that basically Africans were trained to be clerks, according to Twain Falola, to be clerks to the colonial officer. Isaac Bangari Tabata says that Africans were mainly trained to minister to the whites. So there are of course deficits in this current education, and they are being perpetuated under the global matrix of power, as Professor Sabelo Ndlovukacheni, a colleague at Achimafresh Institute, has extensively explained, and I do see him here. So we need to change the education, and what we argue is that you need an education that is Pan-Africanist in its content, that is Afrocentric, and also will ensure that you achieve African Renaissance. And I explain more in the paper, in the written lecture around this. I mean, African Renaissance, and many people have written about this. I make reference to them. I already mentioned Ali Masrui, but also the late Professor Bernard Makubane wrote an interesting reflection on the history of African Renaissance, and then many others, of course, have written. So we think basically of African Renaissance as a renewal, the renewal of the African continent, and Pan-Africanism, people have written quite extensively about this. In the sense, it's about mobilizing, it's a mobilizing agenda, I argue in this other publication I've written. It's a mobilizing agenda to achieve unity of Africans wherever they are in the world. And of course, Afrocentricity, and here I use Amamazama and Molefe Kete Asante, the two, particularly or primarily Molefe Asante, who's leading on this, who's developed what he calls an Afrocentric paradigm, which basically means that you need to be aware of the historical experience of colonialism and how it has shaped the development of the continent. And that becomes a point of departure. And it's important, I argue, that our education is shaped by that. I already said something about Paulo Freire. And I can say something about economics in particular here. As you know, I was trained, I spent 9 years training at the t-shirt level, the post-school level, training in economics. This is the field that clearly needs rethink, because its theory is clearly outdated, and I say a lot more about this in the written lecture. So for instance, I teach this, I still teach this, what's called the macroeconomic framework, which is basically how we look at the economy and how the economy functions. It's a very limited framework, excludes a number of very important variables. So for instance, welfare never features, well-being never features. Amartya Sen and Joseph Stiglitz and others have been trying to relook into that. But really, you're talking about 5 variables when you think about the economy. And I say a lot more of this in the written lectures, with just investment, consumption, expenditure, and imports and exports. That makes up your macroeconomic framework. But also, just from a theoretical point of view, even practically, economics is very limited on what it can do to bring about development, to advance well-being, but also to deal with the economy itself. So with very limited instruments, I argue in the written lecture, to deal with the price of currencies. South Africa is a very interesting case currently, where it seems clearly, it appears we have no recourse, there's nothing we can do about our currency, given the level of its depreciation, because you have very limited instruments. You can just keep increasing interest rates, but as you do that, you're causing other problems, and you're limiting investment, you're punishing, I'm going to get Minister Parr there, you're punishing the black middle class, the very people that are supposed to be the engine of this economy. So it needs to change, and I do say something about the content of the content knowledge of economics, that an idea that I've been advancing, that it has to focus on what I call, or what some of us call, African economic renaissance. So what is this vision for the African economy? So what is the philosophy that needs to guide the African economy? Particularly because we know that capitalism doesn't work, hasn't worked, and I argue in the lecture that I do not think Marxism could work, socialism or communism in the context of Africa. And I advance what I argue could work, a model or a philosophy that Walter Rodney and Sabramin had written about some time back, communalism, and I try and expand on that. I've got a publication that takes that forward and more work ongoing on that. So basically, there's a hegemon of neoliberal thoughts. In a sense, neoliberalism has become, particularly since the Second World War, a dominant development paradigm. And we know the trouble that this paradigm has caused because it gives preference to the market against the state. In the paper, in the written lecture, I talk more about this, about how you need to reconfigure relations between capital and the state in order that you can advance development, because the way it's currently structured cannot work or doesn't work. And it's not just for Africa, as we know, the whole world is still in the recession, particularly Europe, and many other difficulties that they're experiencing. So this neoliberal dogma, as I call it in the paper, and some of economists who used to feed the world this dogma have since somersaulted. So Joseph Stiglitz, who's become a darling of our continent, very same people who imposed standard adjustment programs to our continent that caused lots of problems until today, and still to come out of those difficult experiences, development experiences as a continent. So this dogma basically privileges profit over people, and Noam Chomsky wrote a book, an interesting book on this very same title. Its failure, as I said, is too conspicuous to be ignored here in our continent, but also globally. Now, going forward, we need to put in place the foundations for what scholars have called, and some of what have called, the glorious future. So we, of course, need these thought leaders, and we need liberation of thought liberation. And I argue that it has to be premised on Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance. And that we do need to better understand our history. And I'm not going to go to detail now, I'm probably running out of time. But in particular, we know that Africans with very limited capacity from the perspective of technology, of ammunition, were able to resist well-armed colonialists as they wanted to occupy the continent, and that is an important part of our history that we should be proud of. I do highlight the Adwa victory, which we just celebrated about 2 weeks ago, I think. And of course, my favorite, the Khoi's resistance against the Portuguese colonists in early March 1510. And India Siswandana, that were told actually in history books that it inspired the Adwa victory. These we need to know more, we need to understand better, and we need to repackage this history so that it can be better understood. So going forward, the steps that we need to take towards this new dawn for our continent, of course in the economic sphere, which is my specific area of interest, particularly economy in particular, that liberation is needed because our leaders still depend too much on imported theories and ideas that are coming from outside the continent on what constitutes development. So they are most likely to ask economists from Harvard and Chicago, and then they forget that there are a number of very well-trained economists here in the continent. So African thought processes need to be deconstructed from the influence of wrong or inappropriate education that the imperial powers inculcated on our continent. And I argue here that this is more the case for South Africa. It might very well be that, South Africa went through what some of us term colonial apartheid, or apartheid colonialism, and the education, or the system of education was really to ensure that Africans remain subhuman and many other terrible things. So we do need to work very hard to undo that. It's important to increase critical consciousness, as I've been saying, and African progressive forces must unite to free the continent from the global imperial designs that I just alluded to. And by the way, I use, when I talk about this, our patron, former President, His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, who's been arguing this point that African progressive forces need to unite, because the issue of unity for the continent is very critical if you are to reconfigure the geopolitical and global power and economic relations. So the true emancipation must be pursued instead of the rhetoric of freedom and independence. And in the lecture, written lecture, I invite readers to look at John Saul's work, who's been consistent in arguing that in the case of Southern Africa in particular, we have not yet had complete liberation. And he makes arguments about how we should achieve complete liberation. So people have been thinking about this.